In the last couple of sections, we talked extensively about how we look at photographs and what types of items move our eyes around the frame. In this section, I'll show you how to place your main subject in areas of the frame that will heighten its importance. I'm sure that you've probably heard that placing a subject in the dead center of the frame usually results in a poor composition. Most of the time this is true. Sometimes you can get away with it, but most of the time it's true. And the reason that it's a poor composition is because it cuts off the visual movement. Our eye goes right to the subject without meandering around the frame first. We may take a quick peek around the frame, but then very quickly return to the centered main subject. This is because the surrounding area is all equal in size. This tells the viewer that it is all similar and unimportant, even if it isn't. When you move something off-center, it stresses the larger area over the smaller area. Your main subject benefits because the larger area emphasizes the main subject, rather than just lulls it to sleep. So, there are several areas or sections of the frame that enhance your main subject, as well as visual techniques that help keep the surrounding areas in check. Let's start with the oldest known compositional theories, the golden mean. The golden mean is found from creating a rectangle using the divine proportion. The divine proportion starts with a ratio of 1 to 1.6. You can then apply that ratio and make a rectangle. Now, let's fill up the screen with the rectangle. When you return to the meeting point of your two lines, you get the golden mean line. Or you can have the golden mean on the other side as well. Now, the golden mean line is a great place to locate vertical subjects in a horizontal frame, as you can see in this image of the statue, or in this image of the dock. It also works in the other direction as well. Take your 1.6 and draw a horizontal line across the frame, and of course you can do the upper and lower golden mean in this manner. So in this image, the horizon is located in the center of the frame, as you can see. Do you notice how static this shot is? It just lacks movement. With this composition, I'm telling the viewer that the bottom and the top are of equal importance, and this leaves the viewer not knowing which one to spend more time with. When you move the horizon line up, though, you add more space to the bottom of the frame, letting your viewer know that the bottom is more important. Of course, the bottom in this case is more important because it contains more visual excitement. In this case, if the sunrise was really dramatic, then maybe I would have pushed the horizon down instead. So generally, you put your horizon up if the bottom has the most interest, and you put it down if the top has the most interest. Same sort of thing in this shot. The line of flowers is placed near to the bottom, and you can see where the bottom horizontal golden mean line is. But your subjects and horizons don't always have to be placed directly on the golden mean. With this shot, you can see the waterfall doesn't line up with the golden mean at all. But it's not really in the center either, and that's what's most important. You can feel the overall balance to this frame. More area on the left, more weight on the right, the frame balances out. Subjects can, of course, be placed at the center of the image, but in most cases, just off-center is better, along the golden mean lines. But remember, you don't have to be exactly on the golden mean line, just in the vicinity. Play it loose here. So in this example, the tree is roughly located on the golden mean. Same thing in this shot. Close, but not directly on the golden mean line. And again here in the shot of Yellowstone, in the vicinity of the golden mean line. Rule of thirds. So we have a rectangle that is made up of a proportion of 1 to 1.6. Well, that is derived, of course, from the original divine proportion. Our camera's proportion, however, is 1 to 1.5. That's because 35mm film measured roughly 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And this is actually very close to the divine proportion. So to create the shape of our frame, take the one line, multiply it by 1.5 instead of 1.6, and redraw your frame. See how close it is. All right, let's fill up our frame again. So now you can recreate the golden mean lines with this new proportion. So it works with any rectangle or square. The divine proportion as a compositional tool is a great theory, but we have to remember not to be too rigid about it. We want to give ourselves flexibility and compose around those lines, in the vicinity of those lines. Because of this, many photographers have adopted the rule of thirds, which means you simply divide your frame up into thirds. And this is pretty darn close to the divine proportion. It spreads out the golden mean lines a little bit and takes them slightly further from the center. And where those lines intersect is an area known as a power point. And you can see we have 4 of them. Now the power points are a great place to locate a singular subject within a frame. But again, we can't be too rigid about this. We have to think in the general area of that intersection. So let's take a look at a few images that are built along the rule of thirds and their power points. Here you can see the moon, and that's placed very nicely up there in the third, and the horizon line also is on the upper third. Here in this meadow photograph, you can see the lower mist line is set on the bottom rule of thirds, and the power points are right atop those trees. This leaf sits perfectly on one of the power points. Here in this photograph of El Capitan, obviously the mountain is my main subject, but this is the brightest area, so this is generally composed around a power point. This shot also uses the horizon lines of the rule of thirds, and you can see the mountain is considerably higher, and this lower mountain is considerably lower than the lines themselves, but that's okay because we're working in the vicinity of. By placing this mountain up higher, we're de-emphasizing the amount of blue sky, and there's nothing going on up here, so there's really no reason to show all that. And by pushing this line down here very low in the frame, we're making the viewer look at this area, and of course that is the main subject. This scene is placed directly on the thirds. And again, you can feel the balance to this image because of that. Here we've got an orange mountain right on the power point, horizon line right on a third, and even a rock on the lower third. Same thing here. Even though the house is to the right and the boat is to the left, they're still in third quadrants, or not quadrants, but in third sections of the image. And again, the horizon line right on the upper third. The lower horizon line's a little bit low, but that's okay. This tends to push the limits a little bit of the thirds, but I feel that it's fine. The idea is that this area is pushed close to this. It's from here, it's just pushed up a little bit. And what that does is it makes us focus on this area, because this horizon line is so low and this is so high. Again, we're forced right into here. You can compose portraits in the same manner. This is photographed on the thirds, as is this one. Here the kayaker sits on the lower third. And in this image, we have just a little bit too much space above this woman's head. And we also have a lot of space down here that's not really defining the area. So let's take a peek at a recomposition. By moving her head closer to the top of the frame, we have actually more impact from her face. We're paying more attention to her face itself. Also notice I didn't crop out the hands. I just left them a little area to breathe here around the corner. In portrait photography, you don't want to cut people at the joints, the elbows, the wrists, the fingers, or the knees. Proper balance in your imagery is important to obtain if you want to keep a certain equilibrium. Now, balance in the physical sense, of course, depends on real weight. But in photography, we were thinking of visual weight. We can recognize objects that we know to have real weight, such as these stones on the shoreline, and equate them with visual weight. So in this image, the right-hand side of the frame feels much heavier. It almost looks as if the whole picture is tilting to the right. The mountain, the fall trees, and the stones all have a lot of visual weight. There's really nothing on the left side of this frame that's heavy. Imagine the scene resting on a seesaw. Obviously, the right side would go to the ground, while the left was lifted into the air. But when you push the heavier subject closer to the center, you can feel the weight shift. This frame feels much more balanced, I think. It's like having the heavier child at the playground move up on the seesaw. Notice how in this image the tilt of the metal column in the center makes the frame seem a little off balance. Now, it's not real bad, this is okay, but I prefer this shot. I think this is a better balanced image. Here the balance is not quite so apparent, but you have to look into it a little bit. In the top we have the mountains, which are pretty heavy. The light area is also pretty heavy. And we have this one little tree down here in the foreground. So it seems like most of the weight is right here, to the left of the frame. Here I moved my position a little bit, and I tried to line up the tree in between the mountains. And again, now all the real weight is right in here. All the contrast, all of the color. Here, it's sort of a blank area. I think this is the best one of all. We've got visual weight here, but notice the tree is now moved to the right, and that lends a little bit of weight to the right-hand side of the frame. Here the cloud's darting off into the corner, and the mountain sort of pushing up and also a little bit to the left makes this side of the frame feel heavy. Here in this shot we've got the clouds to the right, and the mountain is still kind of pushing up and to the left, and so we achieve a better balance. Now, there's nothing wrong with the composition of this photograph, but when you have a subject that's up high and there's nothing below it, it kind of gives the idea that it's actually going to fall down, or there's a tension being set up in the frame. When the flower is closer to the bottom, it feels more settled. So in this case, it's not a matter of right or wrong, but which do you prefer? As we said in the first image, when we see things that we know are heavy, like these rocks, we imagine them having a lot of weight. So if this larger rock was on the top, it would feel like the rose in the last photograph, like it was just going to fall down. But because it's closer to the bottom of the frame here, it again feels settled. Earlier in one of the sections, I showed you a person's movement kind of pushing out of the frame, and here we have the same thing. We've got a lot of weight here with the water, and she's pretty well balanced in the frame, kind of being on the golden mean line, but she's pointing out of the frame. Notice the difference in the feeling between this and this. Here where she's pushing back into the frame, it's almost like she's pushing against the weight, and so it seems to have a better overall balance. This shot has got a very complex balance to it. We've got a light area in the upper right here, which kind of adds some weight to it. And this is almost in the dead center, not quite. And then one small rock out here. But for some reason, it does feel balanced. So it can be very obvious or it can be very subtle. So think about paying attention to the way your objects feel as far as weight goes in a photograph. Framing. This is one of those techniques that's often abused or overused. And I think this is a classic example of where it does not work well at all. Here, we're obviously trying to frame the mountains, but the trees themselves are the framing, but the trees themselves are dark and they're contrasty. And so, because it's a high area of contrast, our eyes go to these trees first and stay there rather than going back to the mountains. Now, of course, we eventually get back there. There's no question of that. But this adds like a real stopping point to you moving into the frame. Now, when you take that same scene and surround it with the framing area, and now the trees have a reason to be here because we can see other green that goes along with it, this is a better job of framing. This I also think is a form of framing. Here the waterfall is the main photo or the main subject, but the trees are obscuring it just a little bit. Not too much, but just enough. Also, over on the left-hand side, we have a repetition of the trees in the foreground. Framing is always worse when the framing area sticks into the frame and it has no physical relationship to what's going on in the rest of the image. And that's where most framing fails. Another type of framing. And we've got a mountain reflection, and it's really being framed by this green area. So this is a subtle form of framing. It's not quite so obvious as the first example. Here again, you would almost say that this shot is really about the trees, but the trees end up framing the canoers. Background has relationship to the foreground subject, therefore the whole image ties together and the frame works. Now here in a city street looking up these buildings, I tried to frame the buildings with these trees, but notice how instead of framing them, they're just obscuring the building itself and the lights. A change of position, and now the building, even though it's got some sticks going in front of it, it's a little bit more clear. We can see it. So this is another subtle form of framing that lets you know you're on a city street full of trees, but yet we get the idea. The idea is about the street lamps and the building. Now here comes a tricky one. I did a lot of examples of this. This is the arch in St. Louis. This image has no framing at all, and the sky looks pretty vacant, and this is not a bad image. It's an okay image, I think. But you could also try framing it. Now in this shot, this is that example of where I say the trees themselves have no physical relationship to anything in the background. So when I first framed this up, I thought it looked good because it was covering up most of the sky. But in retrospect, it's not quite as good as I would hope. This image actually works a little bit better. Now the trees tie themselves together. We can see that there's, the trunks of the trees are getting near to the ground here, and we still have the idea that we're looking at the arch. Here's another shot trying again the trees coming in from the top. And it works okay, but I don't like the fact that there's no real relationship to it. But look at the difference here, and this is interesting to note. In this first image, we've got this one cloud coming down here and this sort of another bit of a cloud here, and then the rest is blue. Watch how the frame changes with just a little patience, and how now the clouds actually are mimicking the roundness of the trees. Now this framing works much better because we're getting a circular effect here. And this one also works a little bit better. So in the previous example where I'd cropped here and just showed the top, now we're allowing the trees to come closer to the bottom of the frame, and it's giving it a root. It's giving it a place to come from. And that makes more sense than just having them come from nowhere out of the top of the frame. And then without any framing at all. So I think the trick to framing is just be careful when things are coming out of the top or just out of the bottom and make sure that they have some relationship to what's happening in the background. Symmetry. This can be a tricky one, and it's one I fall prey to a lot. Everybody has their own little knacks in photography, and mine just happens to be that I love everything to be in order. Have to be perfectly symmetrical, and in this case it's just too perfectly symmetrical. The windows are identical, the tree is in the dead center, and everything from right to left is pretty much the same. As needed as this may look for a moment, it quickly becomes very, very boring. But you take an image like this where the windows are the same side to side, and now you have just one window box of flowers, and that adds for a sense of interest, gives us a place to rest. This is kind of like the idea behind texture and pattern. We need that little park bench in the middle of the park. Some place to sit down and have a rest. In this shot, again, everything from right to left is exactly the same, but we have just this one little jutting diagonal. And that's enough to break up the monotony of the complete symmetry. Here the symmetry of the reflection is broken up. If I'd have cropped it right above these sticks, then the bottom and the top would be precisely the same, and it would become quite boring, even though the mountains themselves are quite extraordinary. So by adding these sticks in the bottom, I've broken up the symmetry. In this shot of the elevators, or the escalators, I was using a slow shutter speed to get the movement of the escalators themselves. But because it's exactly the same from left to right, the photograph becomes boring. All you need is one little accent in there, and that's just enough to break it up. Now this is a shot it's fairly difficult to photograph. You can imagine what the top of the mountain looks like because you can see its reflection here, and this is a better look at it. And it's just a very difficult place to photograph because of the symmetry. And so what I ended up doing was just including a little bit of the top of the mountain and more on the bottom, and now I'm seeing into the lake bed, and so now the symmetry is broken up. Again, reflections as symmetry. Top, bottom, exactly the same, and that equals a boring photograph. Put one little spark of interest in the bottom, and that breaks it up, and it makes the image successful. So in the next section, section 5, we're going to go over different lenses and how different lenses can alter your compositions.